This is Phil Fowave. Today I am going to talk about Disintegrate, a tape by Expose Your Eyes, which was released on No Rent in 2020. Expose Your Eyes is the noise project of English sound artist Paul Harrison, with its inception harking back to the 80s, and he's still releasing under the moniker until this very day. The album packs 15 tracks, of which some may be considered interludes or transitional tracks, with each side of the tape clocking in at about 23 minutes, meaning 46 minutes total runtime. The tape comes in a transparent jewel case, and the J card rocks some clean but striking artwork, with only some bare-bone info printed on it. That being the artist's name and title of the album, No Rent logo, and the track list. No more info regarding the creation of this album is being provided here, which only pushes the odd nature of this tape even further. The white cassette is beautifully stamped with some pretty graphics, track list, and further info. First track, Solarium. The track delivers bleak, grey industrial noise right from the get-go, heavily panned with two individual sounds coming from each speaker. The sounds presented sound a lot like electrical humming, but start to modulate after a short period of time without breaking out much, but adding some mild change in dynamics. However, the piece remains cold and stark. It's interesting though how both channels, even though heavily separated from each other, follow a similar arc in tonal and modulation shifts, and though they are presented in a very separated manner, they follow the same narrative direction. It creates this eerie vibe because both channels don't bleed into each other mixing wise at all. It's a true feeling of disconnect. Second piece, Break. Break delivers some pummeling electronic noise that borders into harshness, but with a focus on pulsation and dynamics and composition. Various tracks that are all harsh in nature, following the same kind of trudging vibe this piece has, come in and drop out. Less informing the volume, but more the color of this piece in a complementary way. The piece grows in size after the first third, adding elements that top off its bass and, though not reminiscent in sound itself, bring an almost siren-like element and purpose to the mix that allows the listener to get out of the grind and see the whole concrete machine with its various parts locking into each other. Halfway through, the piece introduces a compositional shift in that it dissolves the previous scenario except of a few elements and starts riffing on what seems like looped, heavily time-stretched, and crunched guitar maltreatment. That's my impression. If that's the source, I don't know. The overall track knows really well how to utilize its 5+ minutes runtime, using each element for a narrative purpose and sounding really well and engaging. It's gray, still stark in vibe, but has life and breathes, even though it may not be lively much. The loop in the end that utilizes voices which act as an outro to the piece seems kind of random to me though. The loops sound totally potent and well performed, but their placement in the overall composition of Break doesn't affect me much. Next track, Flare. Flare There's a short piece consisting of what sounds like guitar feedback, manipulation, and recontextualization presented in a very blown out, large sounding fashion without being in the face much or relying on tropey reverb tricks to simulate size and sound. I like that kind of droning but dynamic atmosphere, and it could have been a little longer for my taste, but it isn't. So on we go with the next track, Crumble. Crumble certainly crumbles. Being the first full-on maximalist piece on this tape, where it dished some crunchy harsh noise on a bed of pulsating, almost clubby rhythm that takes the role of a bass drum but doesn't really sound like one. It's just a straightforward, simple and effective pulse. Topped off with fussed out noise elements that seem performative and maybe even concrete, not electronic in nature, riff along with the beat, sometimes taking center stage and drowning out the other elements, sometimes not, but still being in constant movement and shifting dynamically, keeping the listener on the edge. The last third of this piece sees a complete shift in performance, reducing the arrangement to some more quiet artifacts that just create an equally intense atmosphere. Voices and crackles picked up by a hot mic create the narrative image of, like until now we were witnessing an endless gas explosion like the sun. And now we're inside and watching the single particles that assemble this kind of natural force. Fifth piece on the tape, Ray. This piece starts out as some kind of a successor of Solarium, the first track on this tape, with similar elements and mixing, two channels blasting cold electronic noise that sounds like a fuse is gonna blow out any moment, with tasteful arcs of modulation and dynamics, even though the latter feel a little less hinged this time around. And it just keeps riffing until a point around the 5-minute mark where the droning of the sound becomes so persistent and established in its own environment that it reaches a little bit of a meditative quality. Other than that, I don't have too much to say about this piece. It doesn't really go anywhere specific, but just exists in its own world for 10 minutes, which I respect and cherish since the sounds carry so little pre-coded information that it really just helped me turn off my head for a bit and just exist in a sea of grey nothing. Track 6, Stalwart. Rhythmic percussive hits being picked up by what seems like an ultra hot mic on a field of hiss and swells of feedback that creep in whenever the patterns decide to drop out for a second or two. This piece comes off as kind of an oddball in its position in the tracklist, as sonically speaking, it packs a completely different aesthetic than the previous pieces. At the same time though, the feeling I'm getting out of this is somewhat similar to the one I had while listening to the previous track, Ray, and that it's somewhat meditative, only this time through the repetition of primal simple patterns. Even though it's really not an appealing piece to me and I have no sympathetic anticipation towards it that makes me wanna listen to it again, I can appreciate the kind of sentiment I get from it. That it gives this image of ritualistic entrancement. If this was on purpose or not, I don't know. 7th track on the tape, Beam. Hard and heavily modulated jabs of the same source sounds that seem to have been used in Solarium and Ray as well form this very swift, agile piece. While Ray used these elements, the two tracks panned hard left and right to create a playground where time stands still. Beam almost riffs on them in a punk rock kind of attitude. Fast, no concept, just creating for the sake of creating. Like creative nihilism in its finest and rawest form. It's a very fun track. There's something about these dry electronic noise sounds the artist is using on a couple of these tracks that feels super hard, physically impactful in their unprocessed nature. The main noise in Solarium, Ray and Beam are really just unappealing droning noises that are being utilized in very effective ways, and also when processed through effects or filtering, it's just to spice up the moment and not to really go anywhere entirely different with them. I really respect this kind of reckless decision making and start to wonder what the intention was in breaking these tracks apart like that. Breach. Breach takes the rhythmic sensibilities that made Stalwart, which was track 6, and realizes its vision of transcendence through rhythm and repetition. Over the course of 5 minutes, 3 different beat patterns, either stemming from performance or loops, hard to say, create a dense, impactful bulldozer that collects more and more rubble along its way. Rhythmic elements keep dropping out and coming back again, building a very dynamic and naturally flowing piece that's certainly entertaining over the course of the whole track. Compositionally speaking, it's well made. Personally, it's just not my vibe and tempo, but yeah, that's just me. Track 9, Disunite. 13 seconds long noise swell that sounds like a deep breath. If this is the purpose of this piece, I don't know, but one gotta respect the inclusion of such an obscure choice at this kind of placement in the album. Rupture. Another rhythm-driven piece that uses a similar sonic palette like Stalwart and Breach, but Rupture executes these kind of patterns a little differently. It's less ritualistic and primal in vibe, but more contemporary due to the layering of drumming sequences we heard already in the mentioned tracks, but also faster rhythms that sound like they couldn't have been performed by hitting something. They sound processed and stripped away from their source object. It's nice to hear that the percussive pieces on this tape have a certain narrative evolution similarly to the other multi-part tracks on there. And it ties in these pieces a lot more, because if it weren't for that, it'd be hard for me to accept their presence and sequencing in the whole track list, honestly. Track 11, Camera Feedback. A reduced but effective setup of sounds that contradict each other make a very interesting piece out of this one. We're having a super fast, percussive, oscillating noise element that right from the starts introduces a speed that makes it hard to catch a breath because it's so harsh and uncontrolled, while it's being topped by some microphone feedback that's going into a completely different direction. It's slow, changing notes and color in snail speed, which makes the wait for the usual feedback catharsis or resolution agonizing almost. I like that track, and for my taste it's way too short. I could have done with a little more exploration in regards of the sounds present, but for what I got, I found it highly interesting and inspiring. Pulverize. What starts out as another percussive piece like some of the previous tracks quickly takes a hard left and implements some heavy as hell scooped synthesizer noise that hasn't been heard on this album up until this point. So just about when I felt like I got a grip on what I thought this album was about, this was a rather nice surprise. The noise feels violent and hi-fi in comparison to most of the previous pieces. Doesn't bring in much dynamics, but baffles with the sudden shift in fidelity. To be honest, for me it's a track that's sole purpose is transporting some kind of effect, since there's not much narrative element still, something the pieces of the second half of this album lack a little in general. But yeah, it certainly rips. 14th piece, Shut the Fuck Up Loud and Fast. After another 13-second interlude style harsh noise track adequately named Separate, here comes somewhat of a standout track. What I find to be the liveliest and noisiest piece on this release gives me some 80s Italian power electronics tape loop noise, blown out voices that swim in a sea of heavy microphone feedback, accompanied with some guitar noise that play in the same tonal register of information like the voices do. Halfway through, the feedback breaks out and simply creates this monsoon of harsh noise that washes over the listener in a fulfilling kind of way. It feels like free falling after that claustrophobic, uncomfortable first part of the piece. Palette wise, I like this piece the best, next to the fuse blowers Solarium, Ray, and Beam. But it's just so short, and I'd have loved to see where the track could have gone. Other than that, I find the progression in these 1.5 minutes the most complimentary and effortless in this overall interesting sounding piece. Track 15, Lake Trip. The last piece on the album consists of a slowed down, heavily distorted and compressed voice recording that is absolutely indistinguishable regarding what actual words it is saying, but paints a composition of sound and movement which I find fascinating. There's a certain pattern, a melody almost, this kind of manipulation of sound sources produces. Given that it's super slow and the voice sound still exists in somewhat of a not too low tonal register, the sound source must be a very high voice, maybe a kid even. Except of the obvious tape manipulation, there doesn't seem to be much processing of the sound going on, which I enjoy a lot. The album presented an odd potpourri of noise and directions until this point, and the straightforwardness of approach and Lake Trip makes it almost like credits rolling, including a minute-long fade out. It's an impactful album closer that leaves one with a feeling of uneasiness, not because the sounds are disturbing much, but it doesn't deliver any resolution. And I'm not even mentioning any catharsis, because that's not really the emotional scope this album set up to begin with. And that's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it gives off a very poised and controlled air, like you only got what you were supposed to get until this point, and there's no extra spill in the closer either. So just consume and leave. General feeling. It's an odd record, as there isn't really a through line here that ties all the pieces together. But it isn't a compilation record or a mixtape either that deliberately shows the different styles of this artist. It is apparent that there are tracks that stem from the same sessions or schools of thought and process and chopped to individual pieces to be placed apart from each other in the track list. But I find that process kind of fascinating as it deliberately destroys the flow and narrative these sonic concepts would have been able to convey otherwise. This kind of decision making I find rather intriguing. The album we have now is kind of set up like a music album with 10 plus tracks each in the default lengths of music songs, while the track rundown itself doesn't even try to establish a flow. The tracks themselves are intriguing enough to sustain momentum, and listening to them in one go, especially as a soundtrack while doing tasks, totally works out. But when I got into the album with a more detailed lens for this review, it became kind of a slog. Not so much in a negative way, more in a testing one. Because the aesthetics and sounds on here are potent and weigh a ton. The assembly of these and the greater concept just don't align with pre-manufactured rule sets much, and that takes a lot of energy to process, at least for me. But yeah, I thoroughly appreciate this decision to deliberately sabotage the listening flow of your own album for a greater purpose. But what this purpose is, at least for me, I don't know. And I don't know if I can bring up the time or motivation to find this out for myself. All in all, great sounds creating a very special vibe that I didn't find anywhere else yet. For enjoyers of early European industrial noise and experimental a la Tamquam Tabula Rasa and Old Europa Cafe stuff, I'll certainly listen to it again, but I gotta build some distance first before I can let it just wash over me again and not get frustrated with what I perceived at times its hodgepodgey track list. Thank you, No Rent. Thank you, Expose Your Eyes, and thank you, dear listener and reader, for checking out this review.